The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot of Martha's Roadside Cafe, a small diner that had seen better days. The paint was peeling off the wooden exterior, and the neon sign that once proudly announced the establishment now flickered intermittently, struggling to stay alive. Inside, Sarah wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning, her movements mechanical and tired. At 28 years old, she had been working at this cafe for nearly 5 years, and every single day felt exactly like the one before. The tips were mediocre, the customers were often rude, and the dream of saving enough money to move to the city seemed more distant with each passing week. But Sarah had developed a certain pride in her work, a stubbornness that made her feel superior to the transient customers who passed through. She had her standards, her rules, and she wasn't afraid to enforce them. The bell above the door chimed, breaking the monotonous silence of the slow morning. Sarah looked up from her wiping and felt her body immediately tense. A large man had just walked in, and everything about him screamed danger in her prejudiced mind. He stood about 6'3", with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His leather vest was adorned with patches and emblems she didn't recognize but instinctively feared. The Hell's Angels insignia was prominently displayed on his back, along with various other symbols that told stories she had no interest in learning. His arms were covered in intricate tattoos that disappeared beneath his black t-shirt, and his thick beard was streaked with gray, suggesting he was somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s. Heavy motorcycle boots echoed against the checkered linoleum floor as he approached the counter, and Sarah could smell the faint scent of leather, gasoline, and the open road. Marcus had been riding since dawn, having left his hometown nearly 200 miles away. The wind in his face and the rumble of his Harley-Davidson beneath him had always been his meditation, his way of clearing his mind and finding peace. Today's ride had a purpose, though. He was scouting locations for the annual charity Ride His Motorcycle Club organized every year, and this particular stretch of highway was new territory. The ride raised money for children's hospitals and veteran support programs, causes that were deeply personal to Marcus. Few people knew that beneath the intimidating exterior was a man who had built a successful construction company from nothing, who had put 3 kids through college, and who dedicated countless hours to community service. But Marcus was used to the stares, the fear, the judgment. It came with the territory when you wore the patch, when you chose this lifestyle, this brotherhood. All he wanted was a simple glass of water. The summer heat was oppressive, and his throat was dry from hours of riding. He approached the counter with a slight smile, the kind of polite expression one stranger offers another in a public place. But before he could even open his mouth to speak, he saw it, that look. He had seen it 1,000 times before in 1,000 different places. The waitress's eyes had narrowed. Her body language shifted from bored indifference to rigid hostility. Her hand gripped the dishcloth tighter, and she took an almost imperceptible step backward. Marcus sighed internally but maintained his composure. He had learned long ago that getting angry or defensive only confirmed people's worst assumptions. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water, please? It's pretty hot out there today." His tone was polite, almost apologetic for even making the request. He noticed a name tag pinned to her red polo shirt, Sarah. He waited, patient and calm, for her response. But what came next caught even him off guard, despite his years of experience with discrimination. Sarah looked him up and down with barely concealed disgust. Her lip curled slightly as she crossed her arms over her chest. "This is a cafe for paying customers," she said coldly, emphasizing the word paying as if he couldn't possibly understand the concept. "If you're not going to order food or coffee, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't just give out free water to anyone who walks in off the street." Her voice had risen slightly, and a few other customers in the cafe had turned to watch the interaction. An elderly couple in the corner booth exchanged uncomfortable glances. A truck driver at the counter 2 seats down suddenly found his coffee very interesting. Marcus stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. He could have explained that he had plenty of money, that he owned a company with over 50 employees, that he probably made more in a week than she made in 6 months. He could have pointed out the irony of her judgment, how she was working a minimum wage job in a dying cafe while judging him for his appearance. He could have demanded to speak to the manager, could have made a scene, could have taught her a lesson in humility right then and there. But Marcus had learned something important over his 5 decades of life. Sometimes the best response is no response at all. Sometimes you let people reveal their character without interference, and you walk away with your dignity intact. "I understand," Marcus said quietly, his face betraying no emotion. "Have a good day, ma'am." He turned slowly, his boots echoing once more across the floor, and walked back toward the entrance. As he pushed open the door, he paused for just a moment, looking back at Sarah. Their eyes met, and in that brief instant, something passed between them. It wasn't anger or resentment on his part, but rather a kind of sad understanding, a recognition of how fear and prejudice could make people small and cruel. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving only the fading rumble of his motorcycle as he pulled back onto the highway. Sarah stood behind the counter, her heart still racing with adrenaline. She felt a rush of satisfaction, of power. She had protected her establishment, maintained her standards, stood her ground against someone who looked dangerous. The elderly couple left shortly after, leaving their usual generous tip, but without making eye contact. The truck driver finished his coffee quickly and departed without a word. Within 20 minutes, the cafe was empty again, and Sarah was alone with her thoughts and her pride. She had no idea that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea who Marcus really was, what he represented, or what would happen when he returned. She had no idea that her judgment, her cruelty, her small-minded prejudice was about to teach her a lesson she would never forget. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning, and Martha's Roadside Cafe would never be the same again. The next morning started like any other for Sarah. She arrived at Martha's Roadside Cafe 30 minutes before opening, just as she always did. The owner, Martha herself, had called in sick again, which had become increasingly common over the past few months. Sarah had her suspicions that Martha was dealing with something serious, maybe health problems or financial troubles, but she never asked. It wasn't her business, and frankly, she had enough of her own problems to worry about. She unlocked the front door, flipped on the lights, and began her opening routine. Coffee brewing, grill heating up, condiments restocked, menus placed on each table. The familiar ritual was comforting in its predictability. Yesterday's encounter with the biker had already faded from her mind, just another confrontation in a long line of difficult customers she had dealt with over the years. Around 9:30 in the morning, Sarah was refilling the sugar dispensers when she heard it. The sound was faint at first, a distant rumble that could have been thunder or heavy trucks on the highway. But it grew louder, deeper, more distinctive. The unmistakable roar of multiple motorcycle engines, getting closer with each passing second. Sarah looked up from her work, her hands suddenly still. A knot of anxiety formed in her stomach as the sound grew into a deafening chorus. She moved toward the front window, her legs feeling heavy, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. They were pulling into the parking lot in formation, their chrome gleaming in the morning sunlight, their engines creating a symphony of power and intimidation. One by one, the motorcycles lined up in perfect rows across the parking lot. Sarah counted them, her mouth going dry. 20, 30, 40 bikes. Maybe more. Every single rider wore the same leather vest, the same patches, the same colors. Hell's Angels. Her mind immediately went to the man from yesterday, the one she had refused to serve, the one she had dismissed and humiliated. Her hands began to tremble as the engines shut off one by one, the sudden silence almost as intimidating as the noise had been. The riders dismounted, and Sarah could see them clearly now. Men and women of all ages, all builds, all backgrounds. Some looked exactly like what she had imagined bikers would look like, rough and intimidating. Others looked surprisingly ordinary, like accountants or teachers or nurses who just happened to ride motorcycles. And then she saw him. Marcus. He was walking at the front of the group, and even from a distance, Sarah could see that he was the leader. The way others deferred to him, the way they waited for his signal, made it obvious. He said something to the group, and they all began walking toward the cafe entrance. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest like a tidal wave. Her first instinct was to run, to escape out the back door and never look back. But her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, watching helplessly as the door opened and Marcus stepped inside, followed by what seemed like an endless stream of leather-clad bikers. They filled the small cafe completely, occupying every booth, every table, every available space. The bell above the door chimed continuously, a cheerful sound that felt obscene given the circumstances. Sarah backed up against the counter, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was it. This was revenge. She had disrespected this man, humiliated him in front of other customers, and now he had brought his entire club to teach her a lesson. Images flashed through her mind, stories she had heard about biker gangs, violence, retribution. She thought about her mother, who she hadn't called in weeks. She thought about her dreams of leaving this town, dreams that now seemed like they would never come true. She thought about how stupid she had been, how her pride and prejudice had brought her to this moment. Marcus walked slowly toward the counter, and the entire cafe fell silent. Every eye was on him, waiting to see what would happen next. "Good morning, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice calm and measured. He remembered her name. Of course he remembered her name. He had probably been planning this moment since yesterday. Sarah tried to speak, but no words came out. Her mouth opened and closed uselessly like a fish out of water. Marcus reached into his leather vest, and Sarah's eyes went wide with terror. This was it. Whatever was about to happen was happening now. But what Marcus pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a folded piece of paper, worn and creased from being carried in his pocket. He unfolded it carefully and placed it on the counter between them. Sarah's eyes darted down to the paper, then back up to Marcus's face, confused and terrified in equal measure. "I did some research last night," Marcus said, his tone conversational, as if they were old friends catching up. "Found out some interesting things about this place. About Martha. About the situation here." Sarah's mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. This wasn't what she had expected. There was no anger in his voice, no threat, no violence. Just calm, measured words that somehow felt more intimidating than any display of aggression could have been. Marcus tapped the paper on the counter with one thick finger. "Martha's Roadside Cafe has been in operation for 37 years. Martha herself is 72 years old and has been battling cancer for the past 8 months. The medical bills have put her deep into debt. The bank is threatening foreclosure. This place has maybe 2 months before it closes forever." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. How did he know all of this? She had suspected Martha was sick, but cancer? Foreclosure? The full weight of the situation hit her like a physical blow. Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "This cafe is a landmark in this community. Families have been coming here for generations. It's where people propose, celebrate anniversaries, mourn losses, mark the important moments of their lives. And it's about to disappear because one elderly woman can't afford to keep fighting both cancer and debt at the same time." He paused, letting his words sink in. The other bikers remained silent, a wall of leather and steel behind their leader, bearing witness to this moment. "Yesterday, you refused me a glass of water," Marcus said, and now Sarah could hear something else in his voice. Not anger, but disappointment. Sadness even. "You judge me based on what I look like, how I dress, the patches I wear. You decided I wasn't worthy of basic human kindness. A glass of water, Sarah. That's all I asked for." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Shame washed over her in waves, hot and suffocating. She wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow make this right, but Marcus wasn't finished. He gestured to the group behind him, and for the first time, Sarah really looked at them. She saw their faces, individual and human, not just a threatening mass of leather and metal. "These people," Marcus continued, "are teachers, nurses, business owners, veterans, parents, grandparents. We're the Hell's Angels, Yes, but we're also human beings who believe in community, in helping those who can't help themselves, in standing up for what's right. He picked up the paper from the counter and handed it directly to Sarah. Her hand shook as she took it, and when she looked down, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was a check, made out to Martha's Roadside Cafe. The amount made Sarah's knees weak. $50,000. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes wide with shock and confusion, tears now streaming freely down her face. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of cruel joke. Every year, Marcus explained, our club does a charity ride. We raise money for causes that matter. This year, we've decided that saving this cafe, saving Martha's legacy, is worth fighting for. That check covers her medical bills and the back rent on this building. It gives her a chance to fight her cancer without worrying about losing everything she's built. The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sobbing. She couldn't process what was happening. She had expected violence, revenge, destruction. Instead, she was holding a lifeline, a miracle, salvation for a place and a person she cared about more than she had realized until this very moment. We'll be back next week, Marcus said, turning to leave. And when we come back, I'm going to order a glass of water. And this time, Sarah, I hope you'll see me as a human being first and judge me by my character, not my appearance. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, the check still trembling in her hands, as Marcus and his group began to file out of the cafe. Each biker nodded respectfully as they passed, some offering small smiles, others simply acknowledging her with a brief glance. She watched through tear-blurred eyes as they mounted their motorcycles, the choreography of their departure as organized and purposeful as their arrival had been. Within minutes, the parking lot was empty except for the fading rumble of engines disappearing down the highway. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked down at the check again, running her fingers over the numbers as if touching them would confirm they were real. $50,000. It wasn't just money. It was hope. It was redemption. It was a second chance for Martha, for the cafe, for everything. Her hand was still shaking as she pulled out her phone and dialed Martha's number. The phone rang 4 times before the elderly woman answered, her voice weak and tired. "Martha," Sarah said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Martha, you need to sit down. Something incredible just happened." Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah explained everything. The biker from yesterday, her refusal to serve him, his return this morning with the entire club, and most importantly, the check. Martha was silent for a long moment after Sarah finished, and when she finally spoke, she was crying. "I don't understand," Martha whispered. "Why would they do this for me? I don't even know these people." Sarah realized in that moment that she didn't have a good answer. She didn't understand it either. All she knew was that she had been completely, utterly wrong about everything. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Sarah couldn't focus on work, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She kept replaying the encounter in her mind, seeing Marcus's face, hearing his words, feeling the weight of her own shame and prejudice. She'd judged him so quickly, so harshly, based on nothing more than his appearance. She had denied him basic human dignity over a glass of water, something that cost nothing, meant nothing to her, but would have been a simple act of kindness to him. And his response had been to give everything, to show her what real character looked like, to teach her a lesson without cruelty or revenge. It was a lesson she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. News of what happened spread through the small community like wildfire. By the next morning, the local newspaper had picked up the story. "Hell's Angels save historic roadside cafe," the headline read. Television crews showed up, wanting interviews, wanting to capture this feel-good story for the evening news. Sarah declined all interviews at first, too ashamed of her role in the story to want any attention. But Martha, despite her illness, insisted. "People need to hear the truth," Martha told her. "All of it, including your part. That's how we grow, Sarah. That's how we become better." So Sarah agreed to tell her story, the whole story, including her prejudice and her mistake. The interview was one of the hardest things Sarah had ever done. Sitting in front of cameras, admitting to thousands of viewers that she had been wrong, that she had judged someone unfairly, that her prejudice had almost cost her the opportunity to witness something beautiful. She talked about how Marcus could have humiliated her, could have destroyed her with his response, but instead chose grace and generosity. She talked about the lesson she learned about looking beyond appearances, about the danger of assumptions, about the importance of treating every person with basic human dignity regardless of how they look or dress. Her voice shook throughout the interview, and she cried more than once, but she told the truth. Every uncomfortable, humbling bit of it. The response was overwhelming. The story went viral, shared millions of times across social media platforms. But the narrative wasn't about Sarah's redemption or learning experience. It was about Marcus and the Hells Angels, about the good work they did in communities across the country, about the misconceptions people had about motorcycle clubs. Marcus himself was interviewed by several national news outlets, and his quiet dignity and articulate responses surprised people who had expected something very different. He talked about the importance of community service, about how the Hells Angels had been involved in charity work for decades, about how they had raised millions of dollars for causes ranging from children's hospitals to veteran support programs to disaster relief. 1 week later, exactly as he had promised, Marcus returned to Martha's Roadside Cafe. This time he came alone, parking his motorcycle in the same spot he had occupied during his first visit. Sarah saw him through the window and felt her heart rate increase. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was nervousness, anticipation, and a desperate desire to make things right. She watched as he dismounted, removed his helmet, and walked toward the entrance. The bell chimed as he entered, and Sarah was already moving toward him, a glass of ice water in her hand. She had been keeping it ready, changing it out every hour to make sure it stayed cold, waiting for this moment. "Good morning, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her emotions. She placed a glass of water on the counter in front of him. "On the house. And I owe you an apology. A real one. Not just words, but a commitment to be better, to do better, to see people for who they are rather than what they look like." Marcus looked at the water, then at Sarah, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw him smile. A real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and softer. "Apology accepted," he said simply, picking up the glass and taking a long drink. "And thank you. This is exactly what I needed." They talked for over an hour that morning. Sarah learned about Marcus's life, his business, his family, his decades of involvement with the Hells Angels. She learned about the charity work, the community outreach, the countless hours spent helping people who needed it most. Marcus told her stories that made her laugh and stories that made her cry. He talked about the prejudice he and his club members faced regularly, how they had learned to live with it, how they tried to change perceptions through actions rather than words. Sarah shared her own story too, her struggles, her dreams, her regrets. It was a conversation between two human beings, stripped of assumptions and prejudice, honest and real. Martha came in during their conversation, looking frail but determined. She had insisted on coming despite her treatment, wanting to thank Marcus in person. The moment she saw him, tears began streaming down her weathered face. Marcus stood immediately, and Martha embraced him like he was family, like he was a son she had never met but had always loved. "You saved my life," Martha whispered against his leather vest. "You saved everything I built, everything I care about. I don't know how to thank you." Marcus gently patted her back, and when they separated, Sarah could see that his eyes were moist too. "You don't need to thank me, Martha," he said softly. "Places like this, people like you're what makes community strong. We just wanted to make sure that strength continues." Over the following months, Martha's Roadside Cafe experienced a renaissance. The story had brought attention, and that attention brought customers. People drove hours out of their way just to visit the cafe that had been saved by the Hells Angels. Martha's health improved with the stress of financial worry lifted from her shoulders. She was able to focus on treatment, on healing, on enjoying the cafe she loved without the constant fear of losing it. Sarah became the assistant manager, and eventually, when Martha decided to retire, she bought the cafe, renaming it Martha's legacy, in honor of the woman who had given her a chance when she needed it most. The Hells Angels became regular visitors, stopping by whenever their rides brought them through the area. Each visit was a reminder to Sarah of the lesson she had learned, of how close she had come to missing out on knowing truly remarkable people because of her own narrow-mindedness. She kept the newspaper article framed behind the counter, not as a celebration, but as a reminder. A reminder that character isn't determined by appearance, that kindness can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the people we fear the most are the ones who end up teaching us the most important lessons about humanity, compassion, and grace. Marcus's simple request for water had changed everything, and Sarah made sure that from that day forward, every single person who walked through her door was treated with dignity, respect, and the basic kindness that every human being deserves.